The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth as 12-year-old Tommy Mackenzie stumbled toward the imposing gates of the Double R Ranch. His clothes hung in tatters, his face streaked with dirt and tears, and his stomach gnawed at him like a hungry wolf. Behind him, the graves of his parents grew smaller in the distance, 2 wooden crosses marking the end of everything he'd ever known. The ranch house loomed before him like a fortress, its whitewashed walls gleaming in the harsh afternoon light. Cattle dotted the sprawling pastures, and the sound of hammering echoed from the blacksmith's shop. This was prosperity incarnate in a land where most folks scratched out a living from dust and determination. Tommy's bare feet shuffled through the dirt as he approached the front porch, where a woman sat in a rocking chair, snapping green beans with mechanical precision. Rebecca Richardson was a formidable sight, tall, sharp-featured, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her blue dress was pristine despite the desert heat, and her pale eyes held the kind of coldness that came from too much loss and too little hope. "Ma'am?" Tommy's voice cracked as he called out, his throat parched from the long walk. Becca's hands stilled on the beans, and she looked up with the expression of someone who'd been interrupted during important business. Her gaze swept over the boy, taking in his obvious desperation with practiced indifference. "What do you want, boy?" Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Tommy swallowed hard, summoning what little courage remained in his small frame. "Please, ma'am. My folks, they're dead. Fever took 'em both last week. I ain't got nowhere to go, and I heard tell you might." "Stop right there." Becca's voice cut through his plea like a blade. She stood abruptly, the bowl of beans clattering to the porch floor. "I don't help orphans. This is a working ranch, not a charity house for every stray that wanders up my drive." The words hit Tommy like physical blows. He'd walked 15 miles in the blazing sun, sustained only by the hope that someone, anyone, might show him kindness. "But ma'am, I can work. I'm strong for my age and I know horses. My pa taught me." I said no. Becca's shout echoed across the yard, causing several ranch hands to look up from their work. "Now get off my property before I set the dogs on you." Tommy's shoulders sagged in defeat. He'd heard stories about the widow Richardson, how she turned hard as granite after her husband's death 5 years ago, how she ran her ranch with an iron fist and a heart of stone. But desperation had made him hope that maybe, just maybe, she might have some mercy left in her soul. As he turned to leave, his mind raced through the few facts he knew about this place. His father had mentioned the Double R Ranch before, usually in hushed tones around the campfire. There had been stories, something about a man named Richardson who died under mysterious circumstances, leaving his young wife to run the largest spread in 3 counties. Suddenly, a memory surfaced like a bubble rising from deep water. His father, drunk on rotgut whiskey one night, rambling about old times and older debts. A name had been mentioned, a name that had made his mother go pale and quickly changed the subject. Tommy stopped walking and turned back toward the porch, where Becca stood with her arms crossed, waiting for him to disappear. His heart hammered against his ribs as he gathered the courage to speak the words that might either save him or get him shot. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice stronger now. "Did you know a man named Jack Mackenzie?" The effect was immediate and dramatic. Becca's face went white as fresh snow, and she gripped the porch railing so hard her knuckles turned bone pale. The bowl of scattered beans lay forgotten at her feet as she stared at the boy with something that might have been recognition dawning in her eyes. "What did you say?" Her voice was barely a whisper now, all the earlier authority drained away. Tommy took a tentative step closer, sensing that he'd struck something vital. "Jack Mackenzie. He was my pa. He used to talk about this place sometimes, about a man named Richardson and—" He paused, watching her face carefully. "And about a promise he made." Becca's legs seemed to give out beneath her, and she sank back into the rocking chair as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her pale eyes searched Tommy's face with desperate intensity, looking for something. Some resemblance, some proof that this wasn't just a cruel coincidence. "Jack Mackenzie," she repeated, the name falling from her lips like a prayer or a curse. "Dear God in heaven, you're Jack's boy." The silence stretched between them like a taut rope, heavy with unspoken history and buried secrets. Becca's hands trembled as she studied Tommy's face, seeing now what she'd missed before, the stubborn set of his jaw that was pure Jack Mackenzie, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, the determined glint in his brown eyes that had once made her heart race. "Come here, boy," she said finally, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Come up on the porch where I can get a proper look at you." Tommy climbed the wooden steps slowly, unsure whether this sudden change in her demeanor was a blessing or a trap. Up close, he could see that Becca's stern facade was cracking, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. "How old are you?" she asked, reaching out as if to touch his face before pulling her hand back. 12, ma'am. Be 13 come Christmas." Becca's breath caught. 13 years. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Sit down, Tommy Mackenzie. It's time you heard some truths about your father." Tommy perched on the edge of a wooden chair, his stomach still growling but his attention completely focused on the woman before him. Something monumental was happening here, something that went far deeper than a simple request for help. "Your pa and my husband were partners once," Becca began, her voice taking on the cadence of someone telling a story she'd rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times. "This was before I married Daniel, before this ranch was anything more than a dream and a patch of scrubland. Jack and Daniel had big plans. They were going to build an empire together, raise cattle and horses, maybe even start a town." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the horizon where heat waves shimmered like ghosts. "But plans have a way of changing, especially when there's a woman involved." Tommy leaned forward, captivated despite himself. His father had never spoken of any partnership, any grand plans. Jack Mackenzie had been a simple man, a drifter who'd settled down long enough to marry Tommy's mother and try his hand at farming. "I was engaged to your father first," Becca continued, the words coming out in a rush as if she'd been holding them back for years. "We were young and foolish and thought love was enough to conquer anything. But Jack had wanderlust in his blood. He couldn't stay in one place long enough to build the life we'd planned." The revelation hit Tommy like a physical blow. His father had been engaged to this woman? The stern, cold rancher's wife had once been young and in love with Jack Mackenzie? "Daniel was different," Becca went on, her voice softening slightly. "Steady, reliable, ambitious. When Jack left to chase some fool notion about gold in California, Daniel stayed. He courted me properly, promised me security and a future. So I married him." "But Pa came back," Tommy said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn. Becca nodded, a bitter smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Oh, he came back. 2 years later, broke and beaten down by the world. By then, Daniel and I had built this ranch from nothing. We were successful, respected. And I was—" She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach. "I was carrying Daniel's child." The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together in Tommy's mind, creating a picture that was both clearer and more complicated than anything he'd imagined. Jack took one look at what we'd built, at what I'd become, and he knew he'd lost his chance. But he was a proud man, your father. Too proud to beg, too stubborn to admit he'd made a mistake. So he made Daniel a different kind of offer. Becca stood and walked to the porch railing, her back to Tommy as she continued her story. "He offered to leave permanently, to never darken our doorstep again in exchange for one thing. Daniel was to promise that if Jack ever had children, if anything ever happened to him, we would take care of them. We would give them the life and opportunities that Jack couldn't provide." Tommy's heart began to race. "And Mr. Richardson agreed?" "Daniel was a good man," Becca said, turning back to face him. "Better than either Jack or I deserved. He shook your father's hand and gave his word. A gentleman's agreement, sealed with nothing but honor and witnessed only by God." "But you said you don't help orphans," Tommy pointed out, confusion evident in his voice. Becca's expression crumpled, and for the first time she looked every one of her 40-odd years. "Because I've spent the last 5 years trying to forget that promise ever existed. When Daniel died, thrown from a horse, such a stupid, senseless accident, I thought I could bury the past with him. I thought if I made myself hard enough, cold enough, I could protect what little I had left." She sank back into her chair, suddenly looking fragile despite her stern exterior. "But you have his eyes, Tommy Mackenzie. You have your father's stubborn chin and his way of standing like you're ready to take on the world. And God help me, you have my late husband's honor written all over your face." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Tommy sat in stunned silence, trying to process everything Becca had told him. The woman who had seemed so cold and heartless just an hour ago was now revealed as someone carrying the weight of old loves and broken dreams. "Mrs. Richardson," he began tentatively, "what happened to your baby? The one you were carrying when Pa came back?" Becca's face went ashen, and she gripped the arms of her rocking chair so tightly that her knuckles went white. For a long moment, Tommy thought she wouldn't answer, that he'd pushed too far into territory that was too painful to explore. "Sarah," she whispered finally. "Her name was Sarah. She would have been about your age now." The past tense hit Tommy like a punch to the gut. Would have been. Fever took her when she was just 3 years old, Becca said, her voice barely audible. Same fever that's been taking children all across the territory. Daniel and we tried for more children after that, but it never happened. Sarah was our only chance at a family, and when she died. She trailed off, but Tommy could fill in the rest. When their daughter died, something had broken inside both of them. Daniel had thrown himself into building the ranch, while Becca had built walls around her heart. I'm sorry, Tommy said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. I'm real sorry for your loss, ma'am. Becca looked at him with surprise, as if she'd forgotten that children could possess such empathy. Thank you, Tommy. That means more than you know. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the windmill turning in the evening breeze. Tommy's stomach chose that moment to let out a rumble so loud it could have been mistaken for thunder. Despite everything, Becca found herself smiling, the first genuine smile to cross her face in months. When's the last time you ate, boy? Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. Time gets a bit fuzzy when you're walking in the sun. Becca stood abruptly, her practical nature reasserting itself. Well, we can't have Jack Mackenzie's son starving on my front porch. Daniel would rise from his grave to haunt me. Come on, let's get some food in you. She led him through the front door into a house that was both grand and surprisingly homey. The furniture was well made but comfortable, and family photographs lined the mantelpiece above a massive stone fireplace. Tommy caught a glimpse of a younger Becca standing beside a tall, kind-faced man who must have been Daniel Richardson. The kitchen was a marvel of modern convenience, with a large cast-iron stove and a hand pump that brought water directly to the sink. Becca moved with practiced efficiency, slicing thick pieces of bread and layering them with butter and jam while a pot of stew warmed on the stove. Sit, she commanded, pointing to a chair at the large wooden table. And tell me about your parents. How did Jack end up married? Last I heard he was swearing off women forever after. Well, after me. Tommy accepted the plate of bread gratefully, wolfing down the first piece before remembering his manners. He met my ma in Colorado. She was a schoolteacher, real smart and pretty. Pa said she was the only woman who could out-argue him and make him like it. Becca ladled stew into a bowl and set it before him, noting how his thin frame seemed to fold in on itself with hunger. What was her name? Mary Catherine O'Brien before she married Pa. She was from back east originally, but she came west to teach because she said the frontier needed educated women. Tommy paused between spoonfuls of the rich, meaty stew. She taught me to read and write and do sums. Said education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you. Smart woman, Becca murmured, refilling his bowl without being asked. And your father? What did he do for work? Bit of everything, really. We had a small farm outside of Tucson, raised some chickens and vegetables. Pa would hire out for cattle drives or help with roundups when we needed extra money. He was good with horses, could gentle the meanest bronc you ever saw. As Tommy talked, Becca found herself seeing glimpses of the Jack Mackenzie she'd once known and loved. The restless young man had apparently found some measure of peace with Mary Catherine O'Brien, enough to settle down and raise a family. He never talked much about his past, Tommy continued, but sometimes when he'd had a drink or two, he'd get this look in his eyes, like he was seeing something far away. Ma would always change the subject when that happened. Your mother was protecting you, Becca said quietly. And protecting him too. Some memories are better left buried. But not all of them, Tommy said, looking at her with an intensity that reminded her painfully of his father. Some memories are worth keeping even if they hurt. Otherwise, how do we learn from our mistakes? The wisdom in those words, coming from a 12-year-old boy, stopped Becca cold. Here was a child who had lost everything, who had walked 15 miles in the desert heat on the slim hope that a stranger might show him kindness, and he was offering her lessons about the value of painful memories. You're right, she said finally. Some memories are worth keeping. Even the ones that break our hearts. 3 weeks had passed since Tommy Mackenzie had stumbled onto the Double R Ranch, and the place had begun to feel like something it hadn't been in years, a home. Becca watched from the kitchen window as the boy worked with Miguel, her head wrangler, learning to properly saddle a horse. Tommy's natural way with animals had impressed even the most skeptical of her ranch hands. He's got the gift, Senora, Miguel had told her just that morning. Like his father, but with more patience. The horses, they trust him. Becca smiled at the memory as she kneaded bread dough, her hands working the familiar rhythm that had once brought her comfort during the darkest days after Daniel's death. Having Tommy around had awakened something in her that she'd thought was buried forever, the maternal instincts that had died with little Sarah. The boy had proven himself to be everything he'd claimed and more. He worked from dawn to dusk without complaint, helped Cookie in the kitchen when the old cook's arthritis flared up, and had even managed to make the surly blacksmith crack a smile with his endless questions about metalworking. But it was the evenings that Becca treasured most. After supper, Tommy would sit on the front porch with her, sometimes reading aloud from one of Daniel's books, sometimes just talking about his dreams for the future. He wanted to be a rancher himself someday, he told her, to build something lasting like she and Daniel had done. "Mrs. Richardson?" Tommy's voice called from the yard, interrupting her thoughts. "There's riders coming up the road." Becca wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. 3 men on horseback were approaching at a steady pace, their dust cloud visible long before their faces became clear. As they drew closer, Becca's expression hardened. She recognized the lead rider, Sheriff Hawkins from the county seat, a man she'd had dealings with before. "Afternoon, Mrs. Richardson," Hawkins called out as he reined in his horse. He was a thin, nervous man with a perpetually worried expression and a badge that seemed too big for his narrow chest. "Hope we're not disturbing you." "That depends on what you want, Sheriff," Becca replied coolly. She'd learned long ago that lawmen rarely brought good news to her door. Hawkins dismounted, his 2 deputies following suit. "Well, ma'am, we've had some reports about a boy, an orphan who's been seen around these parts. Folks are concerned about vagrant children, you understand. Bad for the community image." Tommy stepped closer to Becca and she felt rather than saw his tension. Her own protective instincts flared to life, surprising her with their intensity. "I'm not sure what you're getting at, Sheriff," she said evenly. "Well, ma'am, there's been talk. Some folks say you've taken in a stray, and while that's charitable of you, there are proper procedures for dealing with orphan children. The territorial government has facilities." "Orphanages?" Becca interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "You mean orphanages? Places where children are warehoused like cattle until they're old enough to be indentured out as cheap labor." Hawkins shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Mrs. Richardson, that's not entirely fair. These institutions provide structure, education." "This boy gets plenty of education right here," Becca snapped. "He can read and write better than half the adults in this territory, he's learning valuable skills, and he's contributing to a working ranch. What exactly is your objection?" "It's not my objection, ma'am. It's the law. Orphan children need to be processed through proper channels. There are forms to fill out, inspections to be conducted." "Whose complaint?" Becca's voice cut through his bureaucratic rambling like a whip crack. "Who exactly has been talking about my business?" The sheriff's face reddened. "Well, I'm not at liberty to say, but there are concerned citizens who feel." "Concerned citizens," Becca repeated, her tone dripping with disdain. "Let me guess. The same concerned citizens who've been trying to get their hands on my land ever since Daniel died? The ones who think a woman has no business running a ranch this size." Tommy watched in fascination as Becca transformed before his eyes. Gone was the gentle woman who had been teaching him to read Daniel's books. In her place stood the iron-willed rancher who had built an empire from dust and determination. "Now see here, Mrs. Richardson," Hawkins blustered, "this isn't about your ranch. This is about following proper procedures." "Sheriff," Becca interrupted, her voice deadly quiet, "let me explain something to you about proper procedures. This boy is not an orphan in the legal sense. He's my ward, placed in my care by his father's explicit wishes and my late husband's solemn promise. If you'd like to challenge that arrangement, you're welcome to bring a judge out here to review the documentation." It was a bluff, of course. There was no documentation beyond the word of a dead man and the memories of a woman who had spent years trying to forget. But Becca delivered it with such conviction that even Tommy almost believed her. "Documentation?" Hawkins repeated weakly. "Certainly. Daniel was meticulous about such things. I'm sure I can locate the papers if necessary." Becca's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Of course, that would require a formal hearing which would be quite expensive for the county. And I'd naturally have to hire the best lawyers money can buy to protect my interests. Lawyers who might be very interested in investigating exactly who's been spreading rumors about my family." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Hawkins looked at his deputies, who suddenly seemed very interested in studying their boots. "Well," the sheriff said finally, "I suppose if everything is legal and proper." "It is," Becca assured him. "Tommy is exactly where he belongs and he'll stay here as long as he chooses to. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" Hawkins remounted his horse with obvious relief. "No, ma'am. I think that covers everything. You folks have a good day now." As the three men rode away, Tommy looked up at Becca with something approaching awe. You would have done all that? Hired lawyers and everything? Becca's stern expression softened as she looked down at the boy who had somehow become the most important thing in her world. Tommy Mackenzie, I would have moved heaven and earth to keep you safe. That's what family does for each other. Family? Tommy's voice was small, hopeful. Family, Becca confirmed, putting her arm around his shoulders. Your father asked me to take care of you, and that's exactly what I intend to do. For as long as you'll have me. As they stood together on the porch, watching the dust settle in the wake of the departing lawman, both of them felt something they hadn't experienced in far too long. The peace that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. The Double R Ranch had found its future, and Tommy Mackenzie had found his home.